When I listen to some of Trump's supporters, the Heritage Foundation, Steve Bannon, whoever, they're laying out a second Trump term in pretty maximist terms, sweeping out thousands of civil servants, going after the political opponents, using the Insurrection Act to quell civil disobedience, whatever. How seriously do we take the fact that all of the, quote, grown-ups that were going to restrain Trump in the first term, the Jim Mattises and the Rex Tillersons and the John Kellys, are not only not going to be with him, they are increasingly vocal about why they don't want him as president anymore. So what does that tell us about a potential second Trump term?
I would say a couple of things where I slightly disagree with you. I don't actually think these folks are that vocal. I don't hear Jim Mattis out there all the time making a consistent argument. I don't hear John Kelly out there all the time making a consistent argument. I think that everybody, I mean, one of the strangest aspects of the Donald Trump era is how episodic everyone is in how they handle him. And Alex has heard me do this bit 8,000 times, and you know what I'm about to say. And I don't know how many of you are Curb Your Enthusiasm fans, but I bet at least some of you. There's a famous episode where Larry David has a Holocaust survivor at the, I think it's at the Seder table, and then a star from the show Survivor, and they get in a fight, and someone knocks over a glass of wine, and Larry David's mother-in-law sits at the table without moving and says, "Somebody get a sponge." And Larry looks at her and says, "Why don't you get a sponge?" And in my opinion, everybody's method of dealing with Donald Trump has been somebody get a sponge. It is always somebody else's responsibility to deal with dispatching with Donald Trump in one way or another. So I don't actually see a ton of consistency there. In terms of the plans that you're describing, and Steve Bannon and the Heritage Foundation are actually not working in concert, and they actually have very different visions. There are things that these outside groups and these outside advisors are suggesting to Trump that Trump will be interested in. But basically, he will treat these plans, Project 2025 is a term you have all probably heard by now, as pretty a la carte. But that said, Trump is talking about a very radical agenda. He is talking about mass deportations. He is talking about militarizing the border. He is talking about imposing much more expansive tariffs than he did previously. He is not only openly talking about not backing up NATO member states, although I would make the point he did this in 2016 too, but he had this comment about how, and I have no reason to believe this conversation actually happened, but it doesn't really matter, where he told a NATO nation leader that, if you don't pay your dues, I'll tell Russia to do whatever they want. So I'm missing the agency he cares about the most is the Justice Department. And he has openly said, I'm going to appoint a quote unquote real special prosecutor to go after the Bidens. And the implication there is that a real one will charge people, not just investigate. So, and he has talked about sending in the military into cities. He did that once in a speech last year, and not since, and it was almost like an aside. But, there is this thing, Alex and I have had this conversation before too, where Trump is sort of like Babe Ruth-like calling his political shot over and over about what he is going to do. And for whatever reason, everyone's like, no, he's not really going to do that. Well, I think it's a little late in the game to assume he's not going to do what he says he's going to do. And the usual incentives that would keep him from doing things before, people quitting, bad press coverage, elites not liking him, those don't really matter to him anymore. He's been indicted 4 times. I think his idea that he's going to get what he would call a quote-unquote good story from the New York Times, I think the moment's kind of gone on that. So, and he will, if he wins, he will not be running for re-election. And yes, I know then we're going to, okay. Under the current Constitution,
it's a reasonable assumption.
Okay, I understand, but I can only deal in absolutes that are in front of me right now. But that means he will be pretty unconstrained.
Yeah. I want to turn to some of these questions. Alex, knowing Trump's attitudes toward Muslims, will Arab Americans really refuse to vote for Biden? Or do you think Gaza has really had such an impact that they're willing to look past what Trump has said in the past?
I mean, you don't need to ask me, right? They're Arab American voters, Muslim Americans quoted in story after story, week after week, saying exactly that. Will some of them end up voting for Joe Biden? I don't know. But I would say I think there's a tendency to put a kind of binary moral calculus on voters who are actually not bound by that, right? And the notion that like, he's such a racist, don't you know you have to stop him even if you believe the other guy is committing genocide. Well, they actually don't have to do that. They don't need to vote for Trump. They could vote for somebody else, or they could stay home, right? And that's the stay home vote is what Democrats are most worried about, right? They're not worried about mass defection of college students to Donald Trump. They're worried about mass defection of college students to the couch.
Wouldn't Trump have won in 2020 but for the pandemic? Now, there's no pandemic. I'm not sure what the conclusion of that is, but I happen to think that's right, that absent the pandemic, Trump probably would have won because people felt reasonably good about the country.
The economy was good.
Yeah.
I mean, that was what he was preparing to run on when the pandemic happened.
Yeah.
So.
You assent to that?
I don't know, right? I mean, we'll never know. But yeah, would he have been in better shape without the pandemic? Yes, definitely. Not least of all because without the pandemic, Democrats might have fought out their nomination all the way to the convention instead of just dropping the curtain on it in
South Carolina.
In South Carolina, right after South Carolina. But I mean, he's not the president anymore, right? And I do think an incumbent president, you have to have a really good reason to fire them most of the time, right? And much of the country sees Donald Trump as like a quasi-incumbent, but like he's still not the president, and it's a new election.
No, he's not, but one of the things about this campaign, one of the many things about this campaign that is so, I mean, it's so obvious that sometimes forget it, is he's not the president, but he's a former president who a great majority of his party thinks should still be president except for the Great Steal. That's unprecedented. I mean, unless you want to go back to Benjamin Harrison and Grover Cleveland. And I wonder to some extent whether or not Trump's credentials, just because he's been president, make him a really different candidate than he was 8 years ago.
Oh, I mean, I think there's no question about that, although I think you can cut that a couple of ways. He's basically not campaigning, and I think that really gets lost. He's posting on Truth Social, he's holding rallies, maybe once a week. He's not doing anything that you would normally see in a campaign. There is this sort of sense of motion around these court cases, but he's not really doing much. He spent much more time in courtrooms in Iowa, in January, in the lead up to the Iowa caucuses than he did in like events around Iowa. And so I don't know what it'll look like once this trial is over. I don't know what it'll look like during it. It's certainly true that just sort of the prestige of the presidency and the trappings of the presidency still stick to him. And my colleagues and I wrote a story about that, the way in which he has used that to act as if he is a president in exile. That certainly helps him. But I don't know, I think there's enough voters who are not Republicans. You know, we were talking about this backstage in a different context, but there was this this snippet this morning on ABC with George Stephanopoulos where he was talking to Chris Sununu, and he was basically going through the list of reasons through which Chris Sununu would still support Trump. You know, you'll still support him if he's convicted criminally. You'll still support him even though you say you think that he contributed to an insurrection. And he goes through the list, and Sununu says, yes, me and 51% of the country. It's not 51% of the country. Donald Trump's ceiling has been, I mean, this is what Alex was talking about before, has been pretty consistent this whole time. And so, yes, there are people, Trump is absolutely helped by that, but I don't know that he's helped enough.
And just to Maggie's point about the ceiling, we tend to talk about, I don't mean broadly the expansive we, I tend to talk about this election in terms of whether the trial will knock down Trump or whether this will help Trump or what have you. And in a lot of ways, like his number does not move a lot, right? The trial could knock it down a little bit. Acquittal could bump it up a little bit. The bigger question is, can Biden pull his coalition back together? Because if he can, then it's probably game over, right? That if Biden can get the people who voted for not just him in 2020, but for his party in almost every election since then to do the same thing, then it gets really tough for Donald Trump. But right now, today, Biden's not doing that. you.